Those who have been in a coma, did it feel like you missed anything? Or was it like blinking? Did anything seem to change? I was put into a medically induced coma after being found unconscious and bleeding from the head, lying on a train station platform. Was in it for a week and a half. Woke up on Christmas Day last year. When I actually woke up, it was just like waking up in the morning, in that it didn't feel like it had been over a week. I was weaker, due to muscle wastage, but nurses and ICU here are trained to tell the patients waking up from comas where they are and what's happened so they don't freak out. Apparently, I'd occasionally laugh or move or make some sound before I was woken up, but that's about it. I'm a 23-year-old guy for your information. My girlfriend would be better to explain how exactly I behaved while in the coma though. I had a friend in high school who crashed his motocross bike and ended up in a coma for a week. Butthole woke up about 20 minutes after I visited. But I digress. When I asked him about this, he described it, as some have, as a jump cut. One moment he was riding full throttle into a double table on a Saturday morning, the next split second he's in the hospital on Friday afternoon. Apparently the several seconds immediately before the accident were amnesia cause he doesn't remember what happened. What I thought was particularly interesting was that when he woke up he said his body was behaving like he had been working hard, riding a bike for the last hour, sweating, tight, racing heart, rather than lying perfectly motionless for a week. Oh, that's mysterious. The brain works in wonderful ways. I was in a medically induced coma. When I first came out I was very disorientated. At times it felt like a few hours, at other times it felt like weeks. I also couldn't remember the day before the coma, and still can't, which made placing myself in time even harder. I slowly got around to adjusting to the time, but that year felt very quick and I was always unsure of the date when I normally always know it. My dad had a major surgery and due to some complications he ended up in a medically induced coma for a week. His situation is sort of unique, a lot of disorientation before and after his coma, but as far as time passing, he said he didn't remember it, so it just felt like maybe a day rather than 9. I was in a medically induced coma with medically induced paralysis as an added bonus. When I was gradually weaned back into consciousness, I was fairly confused. I had some gnarly butt dreams when I was out and I had a hard time discerning if those were real or not. One of the dreams involved me being in Hawaii. When I was finally allowed to be fully conscious and my breathing tube was removed, they asked me a series of questions. What day is it? I said Wednesday, as that was the day I went into the hospital. I guess I assumed it was the same day. Who is the president? I said Clinton. Turns out that Bush had been inaugurated while I was out, so I got that wrong too. Then they asked me where I was. I said Honolulu. The look on their faces told me that I was so not in Honolulu. It took me about a minute to figure out that I was in Salt Lake City. I remember not knowing how I knew that or how I got there and still being fairly certain that I had just been in Hawaii. I had not. Overall, I'd say that it sucked. I woke up several times in my own head when I was comatose. That was the worst. I was able to hear things that were going on around me and I would be able to feel people touch me when I would wake up in my head. I was never in pain. Also, since they had paralyzed me so that I could heal, when I would wake up in my head, I couldn't move or talk or open my eyes. That scared the heck out of me because I had no idea what was going on. 2 out of 10. Would not recommend. I've had sleep paralysis a couple of times, so I can sort of understand how awful it is to wake up and not be able to move. It really is one of the worst things ever. I really hope you don't have to go through it again. Thanks for sharing. I enjoyed your story. My friend once got a coma from a car accident. He was out for 3.5 weeks, but when he woke up he said it was just like going to sleep at night and waking up in the morning. I had an anaphylactic reaction to aspirin, and when I went to the ER they triaged me wrong and did not get to me until I was fully unconscious and slipping into full shock. I woke up to them trying to revive me and yelling at me to open my eyes, but I was in this place. Hard to explain, but it was just an empty place where there was no emotions or worries or anything. It was nice, but there was just nothing. After they gave me the EP and steroid shot I started to come around and I just remember fighting it because where I was so much better. I went under anesthesia for an operation and I woke up feeling like I just went through a nap. A really good nap though, because when I awoke this attractive nurse asked me how I was doing and I replied quite loudly, "Best nap ever. We should swap numbers." Sadly I passed out a couple seconds later and we couldn't swap numbers. Dat feel. I really hope this takes off, as one of my best friends is going on month 3 in a coma after a drunk driver hit him. From one person I've talked to, he said he could pick out the sounds of people's voices the days before he came out of it and that he didn't feel like anything had happened to him but take a nap after he woke up. Whether hopeful or realistic, it's nice to get out of what if scenarios in my head. That's insane. I hope your friend recovers quickly. I have a drummer friend in Nashville that went into a coma for 2 months. He actually died twice and was resuscitated both times while he was in this coma. According to him, he had a blast. Said he went on tour with a lot of famous artists, traveled the world, banged a ton of hot groupies, and even hung out and partied with Richard Nixon in Brazil. Of course this was one long bad dream, but it was as real as it gets for him. He can recall these stories in vivid detail and they don't deviate a bit every time he tells them. There was a book where a boy with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease becomes comatose and has a long dream like this where he appears to live a completely different life, in great detail, where anything can happen. I can't remember the name, but it's a bang up book. A guy I know had meningitis and they had to put him in a medically induced coma for like 3 or 4 weeks. He was at a bar with a bunch of friends, got sick and had to be taken to the hospital. When he woke up from the coma 3 weeks later, he thought it was the next morning after going out to the bar. To him it felt like a normal night's sleep. My SO legally died for about 30 seconds earlier in the year. We used to do some drugs, and she was revived. It's not the same as a coma, obviously, but she said it was a very warm feeling, but feeling isn't the right word. She also said it was almost like nothing happened, that you could think of it as you're watching a movie and it suddenly skips scenes. That is a strange and interesting description. I'm glad that your SO is alive. Stay safe. I had a brain aneurysm when I was a kid and ended up in a coma for 2 weeks. I remember the paramedics asking me if I hit my head right before I passed out, and I remember waking up in the ICU to a kid beside me watching the movie Jaws. It didn't seem like any time passed at all. But seriously, who the frick watches Jaws in the hospital butthole? The only thing I've experienced was going under for about 45 minutes for a wisdom teeth removal. I hated it. It felt like a part of my life was just blank and like I was never going to be able to get that back. It was like I jumped forward in time. One moment the doc was asking me about my work, the next moment I woke up, trying to suck on the nurse's finger while she applied lip balm. At least she said that it isn't the first time someone did that to her. I was unconscious for 2 or 3 days, I believe, after my 3rd overdose. When I started to become aware, the feeling I had was one of being nowhere. I remember it occurred to me that this was nothing like in the movies. Hell, there were no lights or insightful resolution, no awakening or epiphany, just a memory of the grey nothing I was waking up from. As I became more awake, I started to have a discussion with myself. Due to my circumstances, the conversation was simply about making the choice to live or die. I was a third party to this discussion, which was odd. I basically watched my body and my mind each make their case as to why they were correct. My mind wanted to die. My body did not. An agreement was made. I accepted. And then I started the process of waking up. As best as I could tell, time didn't matter in that place. Perhaps that's why waking up was so jarring. That's my experience with it. I imagine it's different for everyone. This is very interesting. It could almost be a short movie. I have a cousin who was in a 4-month coma. Wrecked his car drinking and driving in Dallas. He was in ICU the entire time at Parkland. After about the 3rd month, I went to go see him because I didn't think he was coming out of it. He lost a lot of weight. He had been a 24-hour fitness personal trainer and was in peak condition, probably the only reason he lived through it. He had to be restrained in the bed because he would try to get up, but he wasn't awake. You could talk to him, and he would respond to questions by squeezing your hand. He came out of it and said it was like he was dreaming, and he could hear us, but couldn't talk, but he was talking back to us in his dream. That was several years ago. He is back to training, but his motor skills are still sketchy, and he can't really control what he says. He literally staggers around and slurs his words like he has had too much to drink. It has improved tremendously over the years, but is still noticeable. I think he was 28 when it happened, and I bet he is 34 or so now. I am not defending his actions by any means. He knows he shouldn't have ever been driving, and luckily he didn't hurt anyone but himself. He will never be the same. I am amazed at anyone that would say that he deserves to die. That's a little harsh. He certainly did not have the intent to harm himself or anyone else. But if he would have, I do believe he would have deserved jail time, etc. But he didn't. Instead he has to struggle every day to function in society, and that to me is his punishment. Car wreck with head trauma. It basically wiped my memory from a few minutes before it till about 2 days after. Apparently I talked to emergency responders, etc. without being necessarily conscious, having no memory of it. Came to senses about 2 days later when I realize I'm in the hospital, going what the frick just happened, and they say, well, you wrecked your car a few days ago. I would try to troll you saying I saw light at the end of the tunnel, but it was just like waking up from a long sleep, except waking up to being broken. I was in a medically induced coma for 3 days after a brain aneurysm. Waking up from that was very strange. Kind of like waking up from a nap that you didn't really fall asleep fully. A buddy of mine got pneumonia earlier this year, and it turned really bad. He went into septic shock and came as close to death as you can without dying. Was in a medically induced coma for like 10 days. He said he remembers going into the hospital and then waking up. Nothing in between. Lost both his legs below the knees and most of his fingers. Not so much a coma, but a couple years ago I had these strange blackouts where I'd be out for a few minutes at a time. I could feel them coming on by ringing in the ears, sound becoming muffled and breaking out into a sweat. Then I'd just pass out. I don't remember actually passing out, it just happens and I drop. I'd be out, but breathing, for a few minutes and then boom, I'm back. As someone described below, it's like you're watching a movie and then it skips a few frames to another scene. I'd be out for minutes but it felt like an instant. It's interesting to see that a lot of people have had similar things happen to them. A few brought up seizures, which is interesting because I was talking to a friend of mine who was with me when I had one of my blackouts, and she said before I blacked out I dropped my head and kind of shook a little bit. This has convinced me to go to the doctors and get checked out for that. Regardless that it's been a few years since my last incident, it's better safe than sorry. Thanks guys. I was in a medically induced coma after burning my legs as a kid. Think I was 13 or 14. I don't remember a second of it. To me, it was like blinking. I remember being on the stretcher in the ambulance, going in and out of consciousness. The next time I either woke up or remember was 2 days later. Had surgery to treat my burns and fight infection. To this day, I don't remember anything about who took care of me, my surroundings or anything else even while I was conscious in the hospital. I remember moving my legs again for the first time being the most painful experience. They had been locked more or less out in front of me for almost 3 days. While I was out of surgery they gave me a morphine drip for pain, which more or less erased the following week from my memory. When I left the hospital it was in a wheelchair. Even after regaining some strength, I do not remember leaving, the ride home, or anything else about being discharged. All I can vividly remember about being at home was that the entire room spun whenever I woke up or went to sleep. To some extent, it was about a week and a half completely erased from memory. When I was younger, about 4 or 5, I got the flu virus, but it traveled to my heart. The chances of you getting it are less than getting struck by lightning. Anyways, after this whole 1.5-month ordeal in the hospital, they gave me drugs that would help me forget this time in the hospital. They didn't really work, because I remember most of my time there, except when I was in a medically induced coma for a week. 1 week I was being wheeled into the air, and the next I was in a 3rd-story hospital bed. A friend of mine got taken off of life support after being in a medical coma for a week, so reading these comments make me feel happy that he didn't suffer while in it. I met a guy who was in a coma for 12 years after a car accident where he was drinking and driving. He was driving his dad home. He ran a red light and the passenger side got hit by a car, killing his dad and putting him into a coma. He showed me a big scar on the back of his head, not from the accident but from his head laying on the pillow for so long they had to cut the dead skin and the soft skull away and replace it with a plastic shield thing. The accident happened in 1996 and he woke up in 2008. He thought he died and was in heaven heck purgatory. He actually said he thought he was somewhere, just not right, and thought everyone was tricking him, cause everything was so different. There was flat TVs and little cell phones. Everyone was older. He thought it was still 1996 and his dad was alive. His whole family was done grieving, but to him his dad died in the car accident which seemed like only yesterday to him. He freaked out and they had to sedate him. He had to learn to walk again, not mentally but physically. He had to learn how to use a computer, because before that, they were primitive compared to what he was seeing. He said everything blew his mind. He still thought he was 23 years old for maybe 2 years after he woke up. His girlfriends moved on, got married and had 3 kids already. His family took his bank account money and put it into a RRSP, so his $3,400 was like $8,000 and they gave it to him. Adding the dream he had. He told me between the time he was out and awake, it felt like he had a really long dream. He was in pitch black and could see himself, like his mind was out of his body and watching him aimlessly roaming in endless pitch black darkness. And sometimes there would be mumbling voices and his body would try to run to them but get exhausted. That's all he remembers. I was in a coma for a week after being resuscitated. I don't remember anything and waking up was like waking up hungover, not remembering how you got where you were and where exactly that was. The grogginess was such that waking up was a long grey area that diffuses gradually into blackness of the coma. I slipped and fell playing tennis and lost my memory of that day. It was just like sleeping. I remember when I came in and out of consciousness, and when I finally opened my eyes and was coherent, but otherwise, just like sleep, except I couldn't remember anything from the day before. Eek. Also went under anesthesia for wisdom tooth surgery. Quick, didn't realize any time had passed. I spent 2 weeks in a coma after a car accident. I had a closed head injury. When I woke up, I did not remember anything. I was partially paralyzed. The only thing I remember is begging the nurse to let me get out of bed. Apparently I had tried to get out of bed and I had fallen down. After my first attempt, they kept me strapped into the bed for a while. I have a vague memory of someone asking me who the president was. I believe I got the answer wrong. I do not have any memory of the time I was in the coma. I spent a few months in the hospital going through physical therapy. I don't even remember the accident. When I was 8 I had this vaccination at school on a Wednesday. I came home at 2 PM tired and went to bed for a nap. I wake up and it's dark. This was unusual because I had overactive kidneys and normally have to get up every hour. I hear my mom ordering delivery and ask what is for dinner and she says it's about time you got up. I looked at the clock and it was 8:30 and say yeah it's 8:30 and mom says 8:30 Friday evening. I ask why she didn't wake me and she says they couldn't wake me. I asked why didn't you take me to the hospital and she said we figured you just needed the rest. TLDR. My stupid parents let me lay in bed in a coma and kidney failure for 3 days for no good reason. Great parenting there. I wasn't in a coma but I passed out one time. I felt so warm and comfortable like I was at home in bed, but when I woke up I was laying in a potted plant with a dozen strangers staring down at me. I was in a morphine-induced coma for about a week. The last thing I remembered was asking the nurse if I was gonna die, and her holding my hand as a response. I didn't know that Ted planned on inducing a coma and therefore felt lost, scared and alone for the entire period as I ran through endless dreams of familiar places looking for my parents, who were on a 23-hour trip to reach me. I was aware of my surroundings to a certain degree as the people who popped into my dreams were actually there. This might have been the asses they were bringing me back. It was a very trippy, scary and disorienting experience. Medically induced comas can be quite stressful. I had a friend who was in a coma for a few months after a freak accident while getting in a car. His brain swelled and they had to cut his skull open. He died a few times. He woke up not remembering anybody at first, not even his mother. After some recovery, he started talking about dreams or whatever you would call them. He said his dad, who had already passed, appeared in front of him dressed all in white. He said he talked to him but could only remember asking why do I still have my clothes on since he had his regular clothes. His dad responded because we're not ready for you yet. He wasn't a religious person either. I don't know how far he recovered. He was talking slow and couldn't move like he used to. He had the same sense of humor, taste in movies and shows, still could play his guitar, but he pretty much was a different person if that makes sense. He started a different life and went his own way. I don't blame him but I miss him. My dad slipped into a coma right before he died and seeing people say that when they woke up, it was just like sleeping, has just brought me more peace than you can ever know. Thank you. Someone punched me in the jaw in 2004. I learned that I can't take a punch, then fell and smashed the back of my skull on the concrete. I wasn't in a coma, but a week of my life was completely erased from my memory. I remember the night that it happened, up until about an hour before the injury. It was quite an interesting experience. I can remember that for the most part my thoughts felt normal. For example, initially I couldn't communicate that I wanted to leave the hospital, except for repeating the word apart incessantly. This was frustrating to me, so I kept hatching plans to try and escape. I remember trying to Google the bus schedule and failing, and I remember jokingly snatching a 20 from my dad's wallet with a smile on my face, fully intending to pay for a taxi if I could get out of their sight. Somehow my rational mind was working at solving the problem of being stuck in the hospital, without grasping the fact that since I had forgotten how to speak I might be better off staying. At first the communication thing didn't cause me a great deal of anxiety. I was just annoyed that these idiots wouldn't let me leave the hospital. It was a lot like when you have a dream where something absolutely ridiculous happens, but in the dream it just seems like business as usual. Not me, but when my brother had his wisdom teeth cut out they did full anesthesia. I think he requested it. I was the one who went to pick him up afterwards as he was still pretty out of it. Before we left, the dental surgeon asked him if he wanted to keep his teeth. He looked her dead in the eye and in a voice which haunts me to this day said, "Of course, I need them to make a necklace. For my robot he has a new dentist now." I was in a medically inducted coma when I was 19 for 5 weeks. It felt like no time had passed at all. However, as they were weaning me off the drugs that were keeping me in the coma, I thought I was at the beach, getting a tattoo of living snakes tattooed onto my legs. I am terrified of snakes, so during that dream hallucination, I was so scared. Turns out the snakes were the things the doctors put onto my legs to make sure blood clots weren't forming. They were squeezing my legs, and that's what I thought the snakes were. It was terrifying. Also, when I woke up, I had no semblance of how messed up I was. I didn't know I couldn't move, or talk, or eat. It was also very scary that 5 weeks of my life had passed me by and I didn't even know. TLDR. I thought I had gotten living snakes tattooed onto my legs. Turns out it was just a coma. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.